He never missed it 3 times a day, until everything took a shocking turn. Wild West Chronicles, let's start. The first time Elias Colt saw the stranger at the well, the sun had barely cracked the ridge of the Cimarron Mountains, and the world was still the color of dying embers. He hadn't meant to stop. He'd meant to ride straight through Dustfall, pick up the shipment of wire fencing from Garrett's supply post, and be back at the ranch before his foreman, Old Pete, started cursing at the cattle for sport. He had a list. He had a schedule. He had 37 head of longhorn that needed moving before the first hard freeze, and not a single waking hour to spare for distractions. But something made him stop. It wasn't anything dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing a man could point to later and say, "That right there, that's when everything changed." It was quieter than that, more ordinary, almost embarrassingly plain. It was just a figure, crouched beside the town well, drawing water in the pale blue hour before full morning, with their back to the road and their narrow shoulders hunched forward, and something about the stillness of that posture, something about the absolute aloneness of it, caught in Elias' chest like a splinter of wood catches in weathered skin. Not painful, not dramatic, just there, present, impossible to ignore. He pulled Maggie, his gray mare, to a slow stop at the edge of the road. The figure didn't look up. They were wearing a battered canvas duster that was 2 sizes too large for their frame, and a wide-brimmed hat the color of old tobacco that had been pushed back on their head so that the morning light caught the edge of their profile, a straight nose, a sharp jaw, a mouth pressed into a line of quiet concentration. They were drawing the bucket up hand over hand, and doing it well with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice and zero waste. No theatrics, no strain. Just the clean, patient work of someone who had learned to be efficient out of necessity rather than pride. They were young. That was the first thing Elias really noticed, past the initial splinter catch in his chest. Young and lean in the way that the frontier made people lean, not wiry from athletics or vanity, but carved down by circumstance, by weather, by the particular pressure of a life that didn't offer much room for softness. Elias wasn't a man who stared. He'd been raised by a mother who believed that looking too long at another person was a form of trespass, and 42 years of living in cattle country had only reinforced that. You kept your eyes to yourself. You minded your business. The frontier was full of people who had come west to start over, and part of the unspoken code was that you didn't pry too hard at what they were starting over from. So he looked away. He clicked his tongue at Maggie, shifted his weight in the saddle, and rode on toward Garrett's. But that evening, when the sun was settling into the ridge again, and the town of Dustfall was cooling down from the dry heat of the October afternoon, Elias found himself at the well again. And the figure was there. Same duster, same hat, drawing water same as before, with that same economy of motion that felt almost like a discipline, as if stillness was something they practiced, as if being unnoticed was a skill they had spent years perfecting. Elias watered Maggie and said nothing. The figure said nothing. They worked in the particular shared silence of two people who have acknowledged each other's existence without yet needing to do anything about it. The kind of silence that is not uncomfortable, not cold, but simply patient, like a door left slightly ajar. He rode home. That night, somewhere between supper and sleep, Elias found himself thinking about the line of those narrow shoulders in the morning light. He didn't examine the thought. He just noted it, the way you note weather on the horizon, not yet close enough to matter, but present enough to track, and then he turned over in his bunk and closed his eyes. The next morning, he was at the well before sunrise. So was the figure in the duster. That was when Elias Colt first understood that something had begun, though he couldn't have told you what that something was, or why it felt, even in those earliest hours, like it was already too late to stop it. By the third day, he knew the stranger's schedule the way he knew the schedule of weather. Sunrise, the well. Noon, the shaded end of the long porch outside the Dustfall General Store. eating something small and deliberate, a strip of jerky, a piece of hard bread from a cloth pack they carried at their hip. Sunset the well again. 3 times a day, like clockwork, like a heartbeat. Elias told himself he was not tracking the stranger's movements. He told himself this firmly and without particular conviction, the way a man tells himself he is not developing a fondness for whiskey when he finds himself checking the level in the bottle 3 times before noon. He was simply in town more than usual because of the fencing order, and the fencing order was taking longer than expected because Garrett's shipment from Tucson had been delayed by a washed-out road, and so naturally he was around, and naturally he happened to be at the same places the stranger was at, and it was coincidence, it was proximity, it was nothing. He introduced himself on the 4th day. It happened so simply that he was almost embarrassed by it. He'd been waiting at the well while Maggie drank from the stone trough beside it, and the figure in the duster had come around the corner of the livery with an empty bucket and had stopped short when they saw him, the way small creatures stop short in open ground, not afraid exactly, but recalculating. "Morning," Elias said. A pause, the brim of the wide hat dipped slightly like a concession. "Morning." The voice was low, carefully measured, not deep in the way of a man who had lived hard years and swallowed whiskey and smoke, but low in the way of someone who was being very deliberate about the sound they made in the world, as if volume itself was a form of exposure they couldn't afford. Elias was not a perceptive man by anyone's accounting. He was a rancher. He was practical and blunt and better at reading weather and cattle and fence lines than he was at reading people. But something in that voice, that careful, deliberate lowness, landed in him like a question he didn't yet have the words for. He filed it away. He did not examine it. He turned back to Maggie. "Elias colt," he said to the horse's flank more than to the stranger. "Got a ranch up on the North Ridge." Another pause, the sound of a bucket handle swinging. Then Sam. Just the one word, just the name, offered like a small coin dropped into a large empty tin, sufficient but barely. "Just Sam?" he asked. "That's enough." He almost smiled. He didn't know why. He pressed his lips together instead and watched Maggie finish drinking. "Fair enough," he said. That was all. But when he mounted up and turned Maggie toward the road, he didn't immediately ride. He sat for a moment, looking out at the empty morning street of dustfall, the shuttered storefronts, the dust still undisturbed in the pale air, the way the whole town seemed to be holding its breath before the day began, and something in his chest was doing something he didn't have a clean name for. Something warm, something slightly alarming, something that felt in the plainest possible terms like noticing. He rode home. He was back at sunset. Within a week they were talking. Not deeply, not intimately, not in the way that would have alarmed either of them, because both Elias Colt and the person who called themselves Sam were, at their cores, private people who had learned to build their silences well and keep them maintained. But they were talking in the easy, sideways manner of two people who have accepted the other's daily presence as a fixed point. The way you accept a particular rock in a familiar trail, not as an obstacle but as a landmark, as a sign that you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Sam was new to Dustfall. That much was apparent without being stated. They'd arrived 3 weeks before Elias first noticed them at the well, riding in on a dun horse named, as Elias learned, Birch, on account of the pale patches on the animal's neck that Sam said looked like birch bark in winter. They'd taken a room above the feed store from a woman named Mrs. Aldrin, who rented to travelers without asking too many questions, which was exactly the kind of landlady Sam appeared to require. They had no stated trade. They did odd work, patching fences for 2 bits, loading freight at the rail depot on days when the train came through, occasionally sitting in at the telegraph station when the regular operator had one of his sick spells. They were good with their hands and careful with other people's things, and they kept their head down and their conversation brief, and they paid on time. And in a frontier town like Dustfall, those qualities were more than sufficient recommendation. Elias learned all of this the way you learn things about someone you see every day without ever sitting down to deliberately extract information from them. In fragments, in passing, in the small coins of unremarkable detail that a person drops when they're comfortable enough to stop managing every single word. He learned, for instance, that Sam drank their coffee black and too hot, and that they had strong opinions about the inadequacy of Dustfall's General Store's coffee supply, which was a position Elias found entirely reasonable. He learned that they read, which was less common on the frontier than people like to pretend, and that they read the kind of books that made you think rather than the kind that let you stop thinking, which was rarer still. He learned that they had a habit, when listening to something difficult, of pressing two fingers to the inside of their opposite wrist, just above the pulse point, in a gesture so small and so clearly unconscious that they almost certainly didn't know they were doing it. He noticed it the first time on the fifth day, when he was telling them about the flood that had taken half his north pasture 3 years back, and he noticed it every time after that, and he did not mention it, because to mention it would have been a trespass. He also learned more slowly, more carefully, because this was a thing that Sam did not drop in passing, but rather revealed in the way a stone wall reveals what's behind it when, over time, a single stone shifts, that whatever Sam was running from, they were running from it hard and fast, and without much looking back. It wasn't a dramatic thing. There were no dark hints, no shadow-haunted glances over the shoulder, no cryptic warnings whispered in the night. It was simply a quality of presence that Elias, in the fullness of his own private and unexamined observation, began to recognize in Sam the way he might recognize a particular kind of scar, not from what it looked like, but from how the person carried it. The way they sat with their back to walls in any room with more than 2 other people. The way they never allowed themselves to be between a crowd and the exit. The way, when a stranger came too close without warning, their hand moved brief, automatic, arrested, toward their hip, where no gun was visible but where something might once have been. The way they ate like someone who had been hungry, not greedily, but with a focused, grateful attention to the meal that spoke of a time when meals had not been reliable. Elias recognized all of these things not because he was perceptive in the way of clever men, but because he had known people who carried the same weight, and because he himself had once been, in a life he had mostly grown past, someone who sat with his back to walls. He didn't say any of this. He just kept showing up. The first time Sam smiled at him, really smiled, not just a tight corner of the mouth acknowledgement but an actual smile, brief and warm, and so unexpected that it hit him somewhere between the ribs, was on a Tuesday, 11 days after he'd first said good morning to them at the well. He'd brought 2 cups of coffee from the hotel dining room across the street, because he'd been in there for breakfast and had thought, in the way that was becoming habitual, about Sam at the shaded end of the general store porch, eating something small and deliberate from the cloth pack at their hip, and the thought had moved his hands before his brain had fully caught up with it. He'd asked the girl at the hotel counter for 2 cups to go, feeling slightly ridiculous, and he'd carried them across the dusty street in the noon heat, and he'd held one out without explanation. Sam looked at the cup, then at him, then at the cup again. "You don't have to do that," they said, careful, a little guarded. "I know," he said, "black, right." A pause that lasted slightly too long, then very quietly, "Yes." They took the cup. They drank. And then, over the rim of the tin cup, in the flat noon light that did nothing for anyone, Sam looked at him with something in their dark eyes that he couldn't quite categorize, something somewhere between surprise and recognition, and a kind of raw, unguarded relief that they clearly hadn't intended to show, and they smiled. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then the shutters came back down, the careful neutrality returned, and they were back to being the quiet, self-contained stranger who gave away nothing. And Elias was back to being the rancher who had no business feeling like he just won something significant by bringing a man a cup of coffee. But he was quite certain of it, he'd won something. He just didn't yet know what it was. Garrett's shipment finally came in on the 12th day, and Elias loaded the fencing wire onto his wagon and drove it back to the North Ridge. And for 4 days, he didn't come into town at all. He had not expected to notice the absence. He noticed it like a bruise. It wasn't that he was unhappy. He had work, plenty of it, the kind of honest physical work that had always been the cleanest solace he knew, the kind that emptied your head of everything except the next task and the next and the next until the sun went down and you ate whatever old Pete had scorched on the stove and fell into your bunk with nothing left to carry. He mended fence. He moved cattle. He fixed the east barn roof, which had been threatening to collapse since August. He did all of it, and he did it well, and he was tired in the good way at the end of each day. But somewhere between the tiredness and the sleep, in that thin strip of semi-consciousness where a man's mind does what it wants without asking permission, his thoughts kept returning to a particular quality of silence. The silence of the dustfall well in the early morning. The silence of a shaded porch in the noon heat. The silence between two people who have nothing to prove to each other and have therefore stopped trying. The silence of Sam. He caught himself on the second day, starting a sentence to old Pete that began with, "There's this person in Dustfall," and then stopping himself and redirecting into something about cattle weight, and old Pete, who was 63 years old and had buried 2 wives and raised 4 children on the frontier, and had seen everything that could happen between 2 human beings, gave him a look of absolute transparency and said nothing. Which was exactly the kind of mercy Elias didn't deserve and chose not to examine. On the 4th day, he drove back into town for no stated reason. Sam was at the well at sunset. Something in Elias' chest settled back into its proper place with a sensation so precise and so quiet that it took him a moment to identify what it was. Relief. It was simply relief. The specific and slightly shameful relief of a person who had been more worried than they'd admitted to themselves and was now no longer worried. He walked Maggie to the trough without hurrying. "Back," Sam said, without looking up from the rope they were coiling. "Back," he agreed. "Thought you'd gone." "Just work." He paused, then added, because something in him needed to, "thought about coming in a couple times." Sam was quiet for a moment, then only a couple. He looked at them. They were still coiling the rope, but there was something in the set of their jaw, a tension, an almost smile, a deliberate neutrality that was slightly too deliberate to be entirely convincing. And Elias felt the warmth in his chest spread a little, the way a fire spreads when you open a vent. "A few," he amended. The almost smile resolved itself, just barely, just for a moment. "Coffee's been bad without you bringing it," Sam said. "I'll bring it tomorrow," he said. "I know," Sam said. And the certainty in those 2 words, the quiet, undefended certainty of someone who has stopped pretending they don't want a thing, landed in Elias like a key in a lock. He drove home with the particular clarity of a man who has just understood something he has been not understanding for nearly 2 weeks. October deepened into itself, and the mornings in Dustfall came in harder and colder, and Elias kept coming into town. The fencing was done. The cattle were moved. There were a dozen legitimate reasons to stay on the ranch and a dozen more to ride into town, and he chose the dozen that brought him to Dustfall. And if old Pete had thoughts about this pattern, he kept them in the same place he kept most of his thoughts, somewhere behind his eyes, available but unexpressed, in the manner of a man who has learned which observations are welcome and which are not. The routine between Elias and Sam had settled. The way routines between comfortable people settle, not through negotiation or declaration, but through the quiet accumulation of repeated choice. Morning coffee at the well. Sometimes a shared silence that lasted 10 minutes, sometimes a conversation that lasted an hour. Noon at the porch, if Elias was still in town, which he increasingly was. Sunset at the well again, where the light came in from the west at a low, warm angle and turned everything in Dustfall briefly beautiful, including the dust and the broken hitching posts and the unlovely clapboard storefronts, and including, in a way that Elias had stopped trying to not notice, the angular face of the person who stood beside him coiling rope or filling buckets with the patient, contained competence that he had come to associate entirely and specifically with them. He did not examine what he felt. He was not, by inclination or training, a man who examined feelings. Feelings were whether you noted them, you worked around them, you did not attempt to argue with them. What he felt for Sam was warm and complicated and slightly alarming in a way he had not felt in a very long time, and examining it too closely seemed likely to make it either disappear or become something he didn't know what to do with. And so he left it alone, the way you leave a fire alone when it's burning clean. But he kept showing up, 3 times a day, without fail. What he was learning about Sam, in the slow and sideways manner of their growing acquaintance, was this. Sam was extraordinary. He had not expected that. He had expected, based on the quiet, the caution, the careful self-containment, someone diminished, someone who had been reduced by their circumstances, someone whose interior had been simplified by hardship into something stark and functional. He'd been wrong. Sam's interior was vast. He discovered this gradually, in conversations that began as small practical exchanges, and then, without either of them seeming to intend it, opened into something larger. Sam had opinions. Sam had ideas. Sam had the kind of mind that moved sideways through a problem rather than directly at it, finding angles and connections that Elias, who was a straight-line thinker by nature, found both startling and genuinely illuminating. They talked about land, the particular politics of frontier land, who owned what and why, the long, slow violence of displacement that most people in Dustfall preferred not to discuss directly. Sam talked about it directly. Not angrily, they rarely got angry in the conventional sense, but with a clear, dry precision that left no room for comfortable evasion. They talked about books Sam was reading, a battered volume of natural philosophy that they'd acquired from a passing trader, a collection of surveying maps that they studied with an intensity that Elias found quietly fascinating. Sam was interested in landscapes in the way that someone might be interested in maps of a country they were planning to travel through, which meant they were interested in landscapes not for their beauty. Though they noticed beauty, Elias could see that, but for their logic. The way terrain tells you what's possible and what isn't. The way geography is a form of argument. They talked about the sky, the particular sky of this particular part of the country, which was enormous in a way that either terrified or liberated depending on your nature. Sam found it liberating. Elias found, in listening to them explain why, that he had never before really thought about the sky as something that could feel like freedom. He thought about it now. He thought about it when he woke before sunrise and looked out his bedroom window at the black space above the ridge, and what he mostly thought was, Sam is probably awake right now, somewhere in Dustfall, looking at the same sky, and this thought was warm and slightly ridiculous, and he did not share it with anyone. There was, beneath all of this warmth, a thing that Elias was aware of but not ready to address. Sam was hiding something. Not hiding it in a dangerous way, not in a way that suggested malice or threat, but hiding something the way you hide the name of the town you came from when you are not sure the name will be recognized, the way you hide the shape of your history when the shape of your history might change how people see you. It was in the clothes, always the oversized duster, always the hat pulled low, always the particular way they arranged their posture when more than 2 or 3 people were around, as if they were constructing a shape rather than simply inhabiting one. It was in the voice, that careful, deliberate lowness that he had noticed on the very first morning, and that still, on occasion, slipped in a way that suggested maintenance. It was in the hands, which were slim in a way that sat slightly outside the common range of working men's hands in cattle country, and which Sam kept gloved unless they were working, and sometimes even then. It was in a dozen small things that Elias, straight-line thinker that he was, kept adding up and then not arriving at any conclusion, because the conclusion they were pointing toward was one he had not permitted himself to fully form. Because the conclusion was this: the person he was falling, the person he was developing deep and increasingly inconvenient feelings for, might not be who they had presented themselves as being. And the thing that frightened him most about this, in the long, quiet evenings on the North Ridge when he had nothing to do but sit with the silence and be honest with himself, was not what the answer might be. It was the fact that, when he reached into himself to find out whether the answer would change anything, whether it would change any of what he felt, any of what was growing in him as steady and unwilled as a plant grows toward light, he couldn't find a trace of one that did. The first frost came on a Thursday, and with it came a cattle buyer from Amarillo named Vic Harrow. Vic Harrow was the kind of man who wore his confidence like a second skin, loud, glad-handing, perpetually amused with himself, the sort who moved through a room as if the room had been built specifically to display him. He was not a bad man, as far as Elias could determine. He was simply a large personality in a small town, which created a particular kind of friction. He arrived at the general store porch at noon on a Thursday, which was where Elias was sitting with Sam in their established arrangement, 2 feet between them, coffee cups, the particular companionable silence that had become one of Elias' favorite things about his days, and he planted himself on the step with the ease of a man who goes everywhere without being invited, and has never found this to be a problem. "Elias Colt," he said this as if discovering a rare coin in a public fountain, "I was hopping to run into you. Got some numbers to discuss about those Longhorns." "Not today," Elias said pleasantly. Vic Harrow did not process this. He sat down on the step below them, accepted a cigarette from his breast pocket, and turned his full attention to Sam with the frank, appraising look of a man who has never learned that starring is a form of trespass. "Don't think I've seen you before," he said. "You work for Colt." Sam didn't look up from their coffee. "No." "You from around here?" "No." "Well, where are you from then?" He said this jovially, as if the question were charming rather than intrusive. Sam finally looked up. Their eyes, in the cold noon light, were very dark, and their expression was not unfriendly but was absolutely impenetrable, in the way of someone who has had extensive practice with exactly this kind of conversation. "Somewhere else," they said. Vic Harrow laughed. It was a big laugh, all teeth. Fair enough. A man of mystery. He looked between Sam and Elias with an expression of exaggerated speculation that Elias found, without quite expecting to, deeply irritating. "You 2 friends?" "Yes," Elias said, before Sam could answer. Something in that word landed oddly in the air between them. Not wrong, it was the right word, or the right word for public consumption, but slightly insufficient in a way that Elias felt in the back of his teeth. Sam looked at their coffee cup. Their jaw moved, very slightly, as if they were considering something. "Nice," said Vic Harrow, who was already losing interest and turning back to the cigarette. "Quiet little town for friends, I'll say that. Not much doing. I'm heading to Santa Fe end of next week, thank God. You been to Santa Fe, Colt?" The conversation moved on. Elias answered when required and watched Vic Harrow talk with the focused patience of a man waiting for a cloud to pass. But after Harrow had finished his cigarette and wandered off toward the hotel to find someone more enthusiastic to talk to, Elias found himself looking at the side of Sam's face in the way he sometimes allowed himself when Sam wasn't looking, and he was thinking about the word friends, and what the word had felt like in his mouth, and what the slight movement of Sam's jaw had looked like, and whether the word had felt similarly insufficient from the other side of it. Sam turned and caught him looking. He should have looked away. He didn't. He held it just for a moment, just long enough that it was clearly deliberate, and then he looked back at the street. Sam said nothing, but their fingers, wrapped around the coffee cup, tightened slightly. And when Elias glanced down at their hands, the slim-fingered, careful hands in the worn work gloves, he saw the knuckle of the index finger go briefly white. He filed it away. He did not examine it. He rode home that evening with the particular buoyancy of a man who has been given information he doesn't yet know what to do with, but is grateful to have received. It was Sam who first suggested the library. Dust Falls Library was a slightly grandiose name for what was actually a single room at the back of the courthouse building, maintained by a retired schoolteacher named Miss Cora Finch, who was 71 years old and had been adding to the collection for 30 years with the systematic determination of someone who believes that literacy is the only real barricade against barbarism. She opened the room on Wednesday afternoons and Saturday mornings, and she made everyone sign the ledger, and she would tell you without prompting what the last person to check out any given book had thought of it. Sam went every Wednesday. Elias had not known this until Sam mentioned it, in the same passing, incidental way they mentioned most things about themselves, as if testing whether information would be received carefully before committing to sharing more. "You should come," Sam said. "She has a survey collection that would interest you, geological maps, some of them older than the town." He went the following Wednesday. Sam was already there when he arrived, sitting at the small table in the corner with two books open simultaneously, in a way that would have looked chaotic to anyone else but which Elias, by this point, recognized as simply how Sam's mind worked. Always triangulating, always reading one thing against another, always looking for the discrepancy or the connection. Miss Finch greeted Elias with the particular warmth of someone who considered the arrival of new patrons to be a minor form of salvation, and she showed him the survey maps, which were indeed remarkable, hand-drawn, meticulous, dating back to the 1850s, mapping a landscape that was both recognizable and entirely alien in the way that old maps of familiar places always are. He sat down across from Sam and looked at a map for a long time. Sam looked at their books. After a while, Sam said, quietly enough not to disturb Miss Finch at her catalogue, "That ridge in the north, that's your land, isn't it? The Colt Ranch." He looked at the map. The ridge was there, unnamed, unmarked except as terrain. "Probably," he said. "No name yet back then." "Did you name it?" "My father did, before I was born." He ran a finger along the drawn contour line. He called it the open hand, said when the morning light hit the rock formations a certain way, it looked like fingers laid flat. Sam looked up from their books. "Does it?" "Yeah," he said, "still does." Sam looked at the map for a moment, then back at him. "That's a kind name," they said, and said it with a particular warmth that he hadn't heard from them before, unguarded, unmediated, simply present. "He was a kind man," Elias said. Sam nodded and looked back at their books, and the warmth in the room, which had been comfortable before, shifted into something denser, something that filled the air between them like heat fills a closed space, not uncomfortable but undeniable. They sat like that for 2 hours. They didn't talk much, but when they walked out into the cold Wednesday afternoon, Sam with two books tucked under their arm, Elias with the geological survey rolled carefully in his coat pocket, something between them had become, quietly and without either of them acknowledging it, a little more intimate. He started looking forward to Wednesdays. He started, in fact, looking forward to every day in a way that had not been true of him for years, not in a large or manic way, but in the steady, ground-level way of someone who has a reason to get up in the morning and knows it and is grateful for it, even if they can't fully articulate why. Old Pete noticed. He expressed this by saying less than usual, which was quite a feat. The cattle seemed indifferent. The ranch continued to function with its regular competence. The open-hand ridge continued to catch the morning light in a way that looked like fingers laid flat. Elias continued to ride into Dustful 3 times a day. He brought Sam coffee. He sat with them in the quiet. He listened to them talk about geological formations and frontier politics and the philosophy of natural systems with the focused attention of a man who is being given something he didn't know he needed and is trying to receive it without making the whole thing awkward by being too obviously grateful. He told Sam things in return that he hadn't told other people. About the ranch, not the practical details, but the feeling of it, the way it had been in his father's time and was in his own. About the years before the ranch, which had not been easy years, and which he described carefully and briefly, the way you describe a long, dark road by nomming only the turns that mattered. About the particular loneliness of being someone whose interior did not match the available words for it. A feeling he expressed sideways and incompletely, in the way of a man who has never found the direct path to that particular truth, but is, for perhaps the first time in his life, motivated to keep looking. Sam listened to all of it with the same absolute attention they gave to their books, reading him. He sometimes felt, with the same sideways triangulating intelligence, finding the connection or the discrepancy, nodding the unmapped terrain. They never pushed. They never prod. They simply listened, and the act of being listened to by them was so different from ordinary listening, so much more careful, more complete, that Elias sometimes had to stop talking and look away until he got his bearings again. The night it almost snowed, the first week of November, when the temperature had dropped hard and fast, and the sky over Dustful was the particular iron gray of a serious cold front, Elias stayed in town too late. He'd intended to ride back before dark. He'd intended a lot of things. But Sam had been at the well at sunset with a split in the rope they'd been using and had asked, in the careful, reluctant way they asked for anything, if he might have a spare piece of rope on the wagon, and he had, and one thing had led to another, and then Sam's lantern at the room above the feed store had been lit, and through the window he'd seen them bent over the geological maps from the library with that particular focused intensity. And he'd knocked on the door because he wanted to show them something on the maps he'd been thinking about all week, and they'd let him in. The room was small. That was the first thing, and he knew it going in, but it was different with him inside it. There was the narrow bed against the wall, made with the crisp precision of someone who made their bed as a form of self-respect. There was the small table with the maps and the 2 books. There was a single chair. There was a lantern on the table and another on the windowsill, and between the 2 of them the room was warm and amber-lit, and close in a way that felt both intimate and slightly terrifying. Sam cleared the chair and offered it to him. He took it. They stood at the table with the map spread between them, and he showed them what he'd been thinking about, a particular formation on the 1858 survey that he thought might explain the spring flooding pattern on his north pasture. And Sam leaned over the table to look, and they were very close, and Elias was acutely, overwhelmingly aware of their proximity in a way that required conscious management. He managed it. He kept his eyes on the map. Sam pointed at a contour line, their gloved finger traced along it. "This elevation change here," they said. Their voice in the small room was even more carefully modulated than usual. It would redirect the snowmelt every year. Consistent. "That's what I figured," he said. And then, because they were close enough that he could have turned his head and been looking directly at them, and was very deliberately not doing that, he said, very quietly, "You're good at this." A pause at maps. At seeing things, he said. At finding the thing underneath the visible thing. Sam was very still for a moment. He could hear the cold wind outside moving against the window glass. He could hear the lantern flame adjusting to a draft. "That's survival," Sam said softly, "not a talent." He turned his head. They were already looking at him. The distance between them was perhaps 10 inches, which was not a short distance, but it was also not a long one. The lantern was on the other side of Sam, so that the light came from behind them, and what Elias could see in their face in that moment was something that he had seen in glimpses over the past weeks and had never been able to examine for long enough to name. An expression that was composed of layers, the way rock face is composed of layers. The top layer careful and controlled and neutral, and beneath it, visible to someone who was paying attention and standing close enough and had stopped pretending they weren't looking, something raw and waiting and real. Something that looked, in the amber lamplight of that small room, very much like the same thing he was feeling. Neither of them moved. The wind touched the window again. Elias was the one who looked away first, back to the map. His heart was doing something emphatic and slightly embarrassing in his chest. He kept his face very still. "I should go," he said. "It's going to snow," Sam said. Their voice was completely even. Only someone who had been listening very closely for a month would have noticed that it was slightly too even. "It might," he said. "You shouldn't ride the ridge pass in the snow, not in the dark." This was factually accurate. The ridge pass was treacherous in bad weather. He had ridden it in worse, but it was factually accurate. "There's the hotel," he said. "The hotel's full," Sam said. "Vic Harrow's people took the last rooms." This was also factually accurate. He'd heard that at the livery. "The chair's comfortable enough," Sam said, and there was something in the way they said it, direct, deliberate, a decision made and stated cleanly that made Elias' chest do that thing again. "If you want to stay." He looked at them. "Just till morning," Sam said. They were looking at the map. Their jaw was set and their hands were flat on the table beside the map, and they were holding themselves with the particular stillness of someone who has extended something and is now waiting without guarantees to see what comes back. "All right," he said, "thank you." Sam nodded. They folded the maps with the careful, systematic efficiency that was their signature. They set them aside. They turned the second lantern down. Elias leaned back in the chair and looked at the ceiling. Outside, it did snow, not much. Not enough to justify his staying, really. Just a thin scatter of flakes that melted when they hit the ground. But it was enough that he didn't look out the window to check until morning. He slept better in that chair in that small room, with Sam's quiet breathing from the bed across the floor, than he had in his own bed in months. He woke before dawn and looked at the map on the table, and at the sleeping figure in the narrow bed across the room, and something in him was so completely and terrifyingly full that he had to close his eyes for a moment. He left before Sam woke. He left a coffee cup on the step of the feed store door, bought from the hotel kitchen, still hot, black. And he rode home with the thin first snow on his coat and the warm weight of the previous night sitting in his chest like a second heartbeat. And he did not examine it, and he could not stop thinking about it. And by the time he reached the open-hand ridge, he had decided, quietly and without drama, that he was in love. He had been, in his life, a private man about private things. This was the frontier, and it was also the 1880s, and neither the frontier nor the time period was hospitable to a certain kind of interior life. He had long since made his peace with the specific shape of his solitude, the particular kind of alone that comes from knowing your interior, and knowing that your interior is not safe to share with most people. He had been close once to a man named Thomas, who had worked the East Cattle Trail and had the same particular interior, and what had existed between them had been brief and careful, and had ended not badly, just inconclusively, when Thomas had moved on and Elias had stayed, and the inconclusiveness had been, in some ways, harder than a bad ending would have been. He had not been close to anyone since. That had been 11 years ago. He was not sure what to do with what was happening now, because what was happening now was different in a way he hadn't prepared for. Thomas had been a known quantity, someone whose interior matched Elias' own in the particular and specific way of recognition, the way you recognize a person because they speak your language. What Sam was, who Sam was, he still did not fully know. What he felt was enormous and specific and daily, and was not diminishing, and was in fact growing with an ease that frightened him. And what he did not yet know was what Sam felt in return, or whether there was a return at all. He thought about that quality of stillness in Sam's face in the lamplight, the expression beneath the expression, the possibility of it. He was probably wrong. He had been wrong before. He was a straight-line thinker with poor translation between feeling and action, and he had misread maps before, and he might be misreading this one. But he didn't think so. He thought, I don't think so. And that quiet, private certainty was the most terrifying thing of all, because it meant he was going to have to do something about it eventually. And doing something about it meant opening a door that he wasn't sure could be opened quietly, in a town like Dustfall, in a world like this one. He thought about Sam's careful, lowered voice, about the oversized duster, about the way they sat with their back to the wall, about the small details he'd been accumulating for a month and a half and not yet fully interpreting. And he thought, whatever Sam is hiding, they're hiding it for reasons that are about safety. And he thought, they are safe with me. And then he thought, they don't know that yet, and I don't know how to tell them. He went into town the next morning, as usual. Sam was at the well, as usual. The snow had mostly melted in the night heat, and the morning was sharp and clear. And Sam was wearing the same duster and the same hat, and their posture had the same contained quality, and everything was the same as it had been for 6 weeks. Except that Elia's was different. He brought coffee. He said good morning. He stood beside them while Maggie drank. He was very careful not to say anything he hadn't worked out properly. He was very careful not to be strange about the previous night. He was, in the way of men who have recently experienced a significant internal revelation and are not yet sure what to do with it, almost exhaustingly normal. But at some point in the comfortable silence between them, Sam said, very quietly, very much as if the words were being tested for weight before being committed to, "Thank you for staying." He looked at them. They were looking at the water in the trough. "Thank you for asking," he said. Sam nodded. Their fingers were on the well rope, not pulling it, just holding it, their gloved hand in the morning light. "Elia's," they said, and then they stopped. He waited. He was good at waiting. "There are things I should tell you," Sam said. "Someday, not today." They looked at him briefly, then away. "But I want to, when it's right, I want to." Something in his chest opened. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And then, because that felt incomplete, because he was trying to be the kind of clear that he hadn't always let himself be. "And whatever it is you tell me, it won't change this." He gestured slightly between them. A small gesture, almost nothing. Sam looked at it, at the gesture, at the space between them. "You don't know that," they said softly. "I do," he said, simple, certain. "I do know that." A long pause. The morning held still around them. Somewhere down the street a door opened and closed. Sam's hand on the well rope shifted, just slightly, until 2 of their fingers were resting, with an ease that was too deliberate to be entirely accidental, against the side of Elia's hand on the trough edge. 2 fingers barely touching, not quite holding. He did not move. He breathed. He held the moment with everything he had. "Okay," Sam said very quietly. "Okay," he said. Neither of them moved for a long while. The trouble started, as trouble in small towns often does, with a man who meant no harm, and caused it anyway through the combined force of his obliviousness and his volume. Vic Harrow had been in Dustfall for 2 weeks by the time the incident happened, which was a week and a half longer than anyone had expected him to stay, and the extension of his stay was due entirely to a complicated negotiation with 3 separate ranchers that he was managing simultaneously with the blunt, cheerful aggression that was apparently his professional style. He had, in those 2 weeks, become a fixture at the hotel bar in the evenings, which was also where several of Dustfall's more sociable citizens gathered. And he had, in the manner of sociable men who gather information the way magnets gather iron filings, collected a great deal of local intelligence. Elias heard about it from old Pete, who heard about it from the blacksmith, who had been at the bar. Harrow had been talking about the quiet stranger up at Aldrin's place, meaning Sam, in the speculative, half-joking way that small-town men sometimes talk about people they find puzzling. He hadn't been cruel about it. He hadn't been malicious. He'd simply been loud and incautious, and had said, in the hearing of 6 or 7 people, that there was something off about the young man, and that he couldn't put his finger on it. But he'd been all over the West and he knew people. And the fellow from Aldrin's had a look about them that was familiar in a way Harrow couldn't quite place, and he'd seen that look before, usually on women traveling alone who had good reasons for not wanting to be identified as such. He'd said it laughingly. He'd said it as if it were the amusing punchline to a minor riddle. He had, in saying it, dropped a match in a dry field. By the time Elias heard about it, 2 days after the fact, the conversation had been repeated, embellished, and distributed through Dustfall's small population with the exponential efficiency of a rumor in a confined space. Most people were treating it as exactly what it was, idle speculation about a stranger, not worth much, but a few had graduated from speculation to certainty, and in a frontier town, certainty about a person who has been passing as someone they're not can turn, quickly and unpredictably, from an interesting subject for gossip into something with edges. He went to town immediately. Sam was not at the well, not at the general store porch, not at the telegraph office. He asked Mrs. Aldrin, who met him at the door of the feed store with an expression he didn't like. "They left this morning," she said, "early before full light." "Left?" "Paid out the rest of the month's rent and left." She looked at him carefully. "You're the ranch man, aren't you? The one Sam was friendly with?" "Yes." "They left something for you." She produced a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket. He took it. He didn't open it immediately. He stood in the doorway and felt the specific, gut-cold weight of a thing he'd feared without admitting he feared it, which was this: that the moment would come when Sam decided that whatever was growing between them was not worth the risk of staying, and they would do what they had clearly been trained by circumstance to do, which was to leave before the danger arrived. He went to Maggie. He opened the note. It was brief. It was written in Sam's handwriting, which he recognized from the library ledger, small, precise, leaning slightly right, the handwriting of someone who taught themselves and did it carefully. "Elias, I heard. I know how these things go. I'm sorry. I should have gone sooner. You were right that you don't know enough, and I was selfish to let it go this long. You are the best thing in a long time, and I wanted to keep you." "Yes." He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his breast pocket and stood very still in the cold November street for a moment. Then he got on Maggie and rode south, because south was the direction most people left from when they left Dustfall in a hurry. He found them 4 miles south of town, at a dry creek crossing where the road forked toward either the Santa Fe Trail or the back way toward the Mesa country. Sam was there because Birch had thrown a shoe on the rocky ground and they had stopped to assess the damage. When Elias came around the bend at a pace that was slightly faster than was strictly safe, Sam looked up from Birch's hoof with an expression that moved through surprise, relief, grief, and a careful neutral composure in about 3 seconds. They were standing in a thin morning light, in the duster, with the hat back on their head and the pack at their hip, and the single worn saddlebag that apparently contained everything they owned, and they looked exactly as they had on the very first morning Elias had seen them at the well, lean and alone and contained and quietly extraordinary. He rode Maggie to stop 10 feet away. Sam looked at him for a moment. "You read the note," they said. Yes, he said. Then you know. I know you left, he said. I don't know why you left when we both know you didn't have to. Sam's jaw tightened. Elia's. You said you wanted to tell me something. He stayed on Maggie. He kept his voice level. You said someday, not today. I'm asking you to make it today. A long silence. The wind moved across the flat country to the east of them, carrying the smell of cold and dry grass. It's not safe, Sam said, for either of us, when people start to notice. People have always been going to notice, he said. That was always true. You knew that, and so did I. He looked at them steadily. That's not why you left. Another long silence. Sam looked at the ground. Their hands were at their sides, and he could see the tension in them, the careful, controlled tension that was their default but was, right now, less controlled than usual. You're going to ask me things, Sam said, very quietly, and I'm going to answer them, and then things will be different. Or, Elias said, you tell me and things stay the same, the way I told you they would. Sam looked up at him. Their face was doing something he had never seen it do, the composure, the layers, the careful neutrality. All of it was present, but all of it was losing. And what was coming through underneath it was something desperate and exhausted and very young, somehow, in a way that didn't match the composed frontier hardness of everything else about them. It was the face of someone who has been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been offered a place to set it down. Sam isn't my name, they said. It's not my real name. He said nothing. He waited. My name is Samara, they said. Samara Voss. I'm from Beaumont, Texas. A pause, and I'm a woman. The wind moved the grass. Elias looked at Samara, at her face, at the dark eyes and the straight nose and the jaw and the quality of expression that had been becoming the most familiar thing in his world for 6 weeks, and felt, with a completeness and a clarity that he would remember for the rest of his life, absolutely nothing changed. Everything he felt was still there, unchanged, undiminished. Everything. All right, he said. Samara looked at him. She was watching him very carefully, looking for the thing that would shift, the recoil, the recalibration. All right, she said. Yes, he said. Elias. Her voice was cracking at the edges now, the careful lowness gone, and the voice that came through was her voice, her actual voice, and it was low, warm, and clear, and it fit her face in a way that made something in him quietly ache for all the weeks she'd been holding it carefully back. You can't just tell me the rest, he said gently. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down on a rock at the roadside with the careful exhaustion of someone sitting down after a very long walk, and she told him the rest. Her name was Samara Voss, and she was 24 years old, and she had been born in Beaumont, Texas, to a father who worked the rail lines and a mother who had died of fever when Samara was 11. After her mother died, things in Beaumont had been complicated in the particular ways that things become complicated for young women on the frontier without sufficient protection. And at 16, she had made a decision, quiet, practical, survival-motivated, that she had been executing with increasing skill for the past 8 years. She had cut her hair and put on her brother's clothes and left Beaumont heading west, and she had been moving through the west ever since, always in the clothes, always with the hat pulled low, always careful, always precise, always a step ahead of the circumstances that had driven her out of Beaumont in the first place, and that had, in various forms, followed her in the years since. She had been in Santa Fe, in Albuquerque, in a half-dozen small towns between here and the Texas border. She had worked telegraph stations and freight depots and cattle operations, and a mine survey camp in New Mexico for 8 months, which was where she'd learned to read geological maps the way she read books diagonally, looking for the thing beneath the visible thing. She had been in every place, Sam, just Sam. That's enough. She had come to Dustful because of the survey maps she'd heard about at Miss Finch's library. She had a system, a long-term plan, involving a parcel of land northeast of here that she'd been researching for 2 years, Land that no one had claimed because no one had read the survey maps carefully enough to know about the water table beneath it. And she'd been working her way toward it inch by inch, saving money, building toward the day she could stop moving. She had not planned on Elia's colt. She had not planned on the coffee or the silence or the Wednesday library hours or the night it almost snowed. She had not planned on any of it, and she had not known how to handle it, and she had handled it by doing what she had always done, staying close to the exit, staying light, staying ready to go. She told him all of this in the flat late morning light at the dry creek crossing, sitting on a rock with her hands in her lap, her voice her own voice, low, warm, and clear, speaking without the careful maintenance she'd been applying to it for years. And Elias listened to all of it the way he listened to things, with his whole attention, without interruption, without flinching. When she finished, there was a pause. Then Elias dismounted Muggy and sat on a rock across the road from her. He rested his forearms on his knees. "The land northeast of here," he said, "near the upper Summerun Basin." She looked at him. "You know it." "I know the terrain. I've ridden it. You're right about the water table. There's a spring source in the northern section that feeds underground for about 2 miles. Nobody's filed on it." Samara stared at him. "It's good land," he said. "Quiet, defensible if you know the canyon approaches." He looked at her steadily. "I could help you file the claim. I know the land office in Trinidad." She was still staring. "Samara," he said. It was the first time he had said her name, her real name, and it landed in the air between them with a weight and a warmth that she clearly hadn't prepared for, because something in her face moved, broke open, reformed. "I told you it wouldn't change this." "How?" she said, and she meant several things at once by it, and he seemed to understand all of them. "Because," he said very simply, "what I feel is what I feel, and I know what I feel." She looked at him for a long time. The morning was cold and clear and completely still. Birch shifted against the weight of the saddlebag. Muggy blew steam from her nostrils. "I don't know what to do with you," Samara said very quietly. "I have never in 8 years, I have never had a person that She stopped, pressed 2 fingers against her opposite wrist, above the pulse point, in the gesture she made when things were difficult. He saw it. He didn't look away from it. "I know," he said. "You make it very simple," she said. "The way you make things simple, I don't know how you do that." "I just say what's true," he said. "That's not simple," she said. That's one of the hardest things there is." He was quiet for a moment, then, I know it is." He looked at her with something direct and honest and slightly afraid because he was not a fearless man and he had never claimed to be. "I've been not saying things for a long time, about who I am and what I want, and I'm going to say them now." Samara looked at him. "I want you to stay," he said, "in Dustfall, or near it, close enough that I can bring you coffee in the morning and sit with you at the library on Wednesdays and know you're somewhere in my world." He paused. "That's what I want. And I know what you are and I know what I am, and I'm not scared of any of it." The word that Samara did not say hung in the air between them. He had not said it either. But they both knew, in the way that people know things they have been knowing for weeks without naming them, exactly what he meant and exactly what she felt in return. And it was the same thing, and it was large, and it was real, and it had been growing between them since the first cold morning at the well. Samara stood up. She brushed the dust from her duster. She looked at him with an expression that he had never seen on her face before, not the composure, not the careful neutrality, not the almost smile, but something open, something that had stopped managing itself. "Birch needs a new shoe," she said. "Gerp's smithy is the best in the county," he said. "I know where it is," she said. "I'll ride with you," he said. They stood looking at each other for a moment. The cold wind moved between them, and above them the enormous sky was clear in every direction, and the world was very quiet. "Elias," she said. "Yes. Thank you for coming after me." He looked at her face, her real face in her real light with her real voice, and all the weeks of careful not looking and careful not nomming and careful management of the fire in his chest gathered themselves into a single clear moment. "I'll always come after you," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she gathered Birch's reins, and they walked together back up the road toward Dustful, and the sky above them was so large it was almost generous. She stayed. She moved from Mrs. Uldrun's feed storeroom to a small house at the edge of town, a two-room structure that had been empty for 2 years, and she rented it for a fair price and fixed the broken step and replaced the cracked window glass herself, doing it with the systematic efficiency that was her signature in all practical matters. She continued to go to the library on Wednesdays. She continued to eat at the shaded end of the general store porch at noon. She still wore the duster, still kept the hat pulled low, still sat with her back to walls. Old habits of caution took time to loosen, but the deliberate construction of her posture softened slightly over the weeks that followed. The voice was still low, but it was her low, and he could hear the difference and loved it. Elias continued to come to town 3 times a day. The town of Dustfall, which had the particular small community sensitivity to shifts in human dynamic, registered something was different between the quiet stranger and the Northridge rancher, and processed it in the way that frontier towns process ambiguous social situations, mostly by minding their own business, which is to say mostly by minding it loudly enough to demonstrate that they were doing so. Miss Finch at the library was serenely incurious. The hotel cook, whose name was Ma, put an extra cup on the counter when Elias came in for coffee without being asked. Garrett at the supply post gave him a knowing look that he returned with complete impassivity. Vaquero mercifully left for Santa Fe. The story he'd dropped in the bar didn't disappear entirely. Things like that never entirely disappear in small towns, but without his enthusiastic maintenance, it reduced itself from a small fire to an ember, and the ember cooled to something that could be stepped over rather than around. He took her to the open hand one Sunday in late November, on horseback, in the cold, clear weather that had settled over the North Country and turned the world into something almost painfully beautiful, all silver grass and blue shadow, and the particular sharp smell of coming winter on high ground. She had been to the North Ridge once before with him to look at the drainage issue his survey map study had identified, and she brought her own map and spent 40 minutes standing in the pasture being very quiet and very attentive, and then told him with complete confidence where to redirect the drainage channel. He'd been mildly staggered by the precision of it. He'd done exactly what she said. It had worked. But this was different. This was not a working visit. He brought her to the formation at the western edge of his property in the afternoon light, where the rock faces caught the sun at the angle his father had named it for. He didn't explain. He just stopped Muggy and waited. She looked at it. The light was low and golden, and it caught the rudgeland and cast long shadows down the rock faces, and the shadows were fingers, clearly, unmistakably fingers, 4 of them laid flat across the pale stone, reaching downward toward the valley. Samara was quiet for a long time. Her profile against the winter sky was something Elias had memorized without intending to. The straight nose and the sharp jaw and the line of the mouth in its default of concentration, and now, softened slightly in the warm light, something else, something like ease. "Your father named it well," she said. "He did," he said. "It looks like," she stopped. "It looks like an offer, not a greeting. Not a wave, an offer." He looked at the rock. He had looked at it 10,000 times and had never thought of it quite that way. "Yes," he said, "yeah, it does." They sat on the horses and looked at the open hand in the afternoon light, and the quiet between them was the kind of quiet that has stopped being simply the absence of words and has become its own kind of communication, full, warm, complete. "I've been thinking about the land near the Upper Cimarron," she said after a while. "I know," he said. He'd seen her studying the maps. The claim filing would be simpler if she stopped. A careful pause. If there were two names on it. Under joint filing, the fee structure is different and the... Yes, he said. She turned to look at him. I didn't finish. I know, he said. Yes. A pause. Her eyes were doing the thing they did, reading him, layer by layer, looking for the discrepancy or the catch. You'd be taking on the legal responsibility, she began. Yes, he said again. And the community association will have questions about. Samara, he said. She stopped. Yes, he said for the third time, just yes, simple, certain, without conditions. She looked at him for a long moment. The open hand cast its shadows down the stone. The wind was cold and the sky was enormous and the day was ending in gold and blue. I keep waiting, she said quietly, for you to want something from me, for there to be a cost. There's no cost, he said. There's always a cost, she said, and he heard in it not bitterness but experience, the specific and reasonable experience of someone who had learned the world's economy the hard way. Not with me, he said. Nothing I offer you has a cost. He looked at her directly. Whatever I give you, it's yours because I want you to have it, that's all. Samara looked away. He watched the muscle in her jaw move. He watched her two fingers go to her wrist, above the pulse point, the way they always did when she was receiving something difficult. That's not, she started. I know, he said. I know it's not what you're used to. A long silence. The horses shifted. The last of the golden light moved across the rock face. Elias, she said. He waited. She turned to face him fully, and her face was open in the way it had been at the Dry Creek crossing, unmanaged, undefended, real. I think I need to say something, she said. Take your time, he said. She did. She looked at the open hand. She looked at her hands on the reins. She looked at him. I have never, she stopped, tried again. There has never been a person in my life since my mother who made me feel like I could stop, just stop and another stop. Her jaw tightened. You make me feel like I could set everything down, all of it, the hat, the voice, the all of it, and just be. She looked at him with something that was unguarded and enormous. And I don't know what to do with that, but I know I want it. I want this, you, all of this. I'm terrified of it and I want it. Elias said nothing for a moment. He was very careful with silence, and this was a silence he didn't want to rush. Then he reached across the space between the horses and held out his hand. Not reaching for her, just offering. She looked at his hand, at the open, rough, patient palm. She reached over and placed her hand in his. They sat like that in the last of the afternoon light, on their horses on the North Ridge, with the open hand above them and the enormous sky in every direction and the cold wind moving through the silver grass, and neither of them said anything else, because neither of them needed to. Everything had been said. December came in hard and stayed. The North Country in deep winter was a different world, white and gray and cut by wind, the distances shortened by low cloud, the days brief and the nights long, and the particular intimacy of a small community in winter isolation, settling over dustfall like a second blanket. Elias was in town every day now. He didn't pretend otherwise. He brought Samara firewood because the feed storehouse had an inefficient heating stove, and he had timber from the ranch. He helped her repair the window frame that rattled in the north wind. He shared meals at the hotel dining room, the two of them at the corner table that faced the door, eating Me's reliable stew and talking in the easy, constant way they had always talked. About maps, about land, about ideas, about the small, ordinary incidents of their days, and doing it with the comfort of people who have stopped performing ease and have simply arrived at it. The town accommodated this, not without observation. There was observation, but the observation was mostly benign, the curious but essentially non-hostile observation of people who have absorbed a new social reality and are in the process of normalizing it. Miss Finch added a second chair to the corner of the library. Me began putting 2 cups on the counter automatically. Garrett at the supply post stopped giving Elia's knowing looks and simply included Samara in the order completion conversation as a matter of course. It was not perfect. It was not without complication. There were 2 or 3 people in Dustfall who had opinions, and they expressed them, and Elias heard them expressed, and he dealt with them in the direct, unhurried, completely inflexible way he dealt with all challenges to things he had decided mattered to him. One conversation in particular, at the livery, involved a man named Craddock who had lived in Dustfall 20 years and believed he had earned the right to comment on its social arrangements. Craddock said several things. Elias listened to all of them without expression. Then he said, very quietly, "Craddock, I've known you 20 years. You're a decent man, mostly. But this is not your business, and the next time you make it your business in my hearing I'm going to find that a great deal more trouble for you than it is for me. Are we clear?" They were clear. He told Samara about it that evening. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he said. "It'll make things harder." "Or it won't," he said. Either way, it needed saying. She looked at him. "You never seemed to count the cost to yourself," she said. "It was observation, not quite accusation." "I count it," he said. I've decided what I think is worth it, that's all." He looked at her. "You're worth it very clearly, entirely." She looked down at her coffee cup. The gesture of 2 fingers against her wrist, unconscious and habitual. "I'm learning to believe you," she said. "Good," he said. "Take your time, I'll be here." They rode to Trinidad together in the 2nd week of January, on a clear, cold day that bit at everything exposed, with 3 geological maps and 2 copies of the pre-prepared claim documentation that Samara had spent 2 weeks perfecting. The handwriting precise, the measurements exact, the legal language correct in a way that suggested she'd been preparing this particular document, in her head if not on paper, for a long time. The land office clerk in Trinidad was a man named Beaumont, which Elias registered with private amusement and kept to himself, who processed the joint filing with professional efficiency and not a single unnecessary question. He stamped the documentation, recorded the claim, and handed Samara her copy with the plain, routine courtesy of a man who processes a great deal of paperwork and does not invest emotionally in any of it. Outside the land office, in the cold January street of Trinidad, Samara stood and looked at the document for a moment. Elias stood beside her and said nothing. She folded it. She put it in her breast pocket over her heart, a gesture so unconscious and so clear that he felt it like a pressure in his own chest. "Samara Voss," she said, reading from the filed record she held. Her name on official documentation belonging to official land. Her name, not a cover story. "It's the first time I've had anything in my own name since I was 16. He looked at her. Her jaw was set in the way it always was when she was containing something large. Her eyes were on the middle distance, but her hand, where it pressed the document to her chest, was not steady. "It's yours," he said, "clean and clear and yours." She nodded once, short, controlled. Then she reached over without looking at him and found his hand with hers, and held it, not the tentative 2-finger contact of the well trough, but fully, firmly, her slim fingers interlaced with his rough ones, gripping with the warmth and the certainty of something that has stopped being tentative. He held her hand back. They stood like that in the cold Trinidad street, looking at nothing in particular, and the winter sky above them was pale and enormous and entirely without judgment, and in that moment something was complete. They were at the ranch house on the North Ridge on a Sunday evening in February, working on a revised survey of the Cimarron parcel by lamplight. Samara cross-referencing 2 maps at once with her diagonal reading method, Elias adding the terrain notes he'd accumulated from 3 decades of riding the country, when something shifted between them. It was not a dramatic shift. It was the kind of shift that happens when two people have been very patient and very careful and very honest with each other over a long span of time. And all of that patience and care and honesty has built something so steady that it can support what comes next. She looked up from the map at him. He was looking at the map. Then he felt her looking and looked up. The lamplight in the ranch house was warm and steady, and the window behind her showed the black winter sky with its full weight of stars, and her face in the lamplight was, as it always was, had always been, would always be, the most specific and important thing in his world. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. She held his gaze. "I love you," she said, simply, clearly, in the same direct, unhurried way that he had been saying true things to her all winter and which she had, over the months, learned to speak. Something in Elia's colt became very still, the way a landscape becomes still before rain, the specific held-breath quality of a world on the edge of something. "I love you," she said again, as if saying it twice made it more certain, or because she simply wanted to say it twice, because it was hers to say now, because she had spent years not being able to say anything that was hers and this was hers. "I have for a long time, and I needed to say it." He looked at her. "Samara," he said, her name in his voice in the warm ranch house in the lamplight. She waited. "I have loved you," he said, "since the morning at the well, before I had a name for it, before I was sure what it was, since the very beginning." He paused. "I love everything you are, everything you showed me and everything you hid and everything you're still finding, all of it." She looked at him. The last of the careful management, the last vestige of the constructed distance, was entirely gone. She was simply herself, Samara Voss, 24 years old, brave and scarred and extraordinary, and he was simply himself, Elia's colt, 42 years old, private and stubborn and more sure of this than he had been of anything, and the space between them was very small. She reached across the corner of the table. He met her halfway. The lantern burned warm. The stars were out. The open hand formation on the western ridge held its shape in the winter dark, fingers patient and offered, the way it had always been. The winter broke in March, the way winters break in the high country, not gradually but suddenly, one warm front moving in over 2 days and changing everything. The creeks ran. The grass came back. The ranch began its spring work with the particular energy of land that has rested and is ready. Samara's land on the Cimarron parcel had its first spring survey in April, conducted by Samara herself with a surveying level she'd borrowed from Garrett's supply post and a set of stakes and markers she'd prepared over winter. Elias rode with her. He carried the stakes. She directed the measurements with the focused intensity she brought to all practical work, calling figures, checking angles, consulting the map against the terrain with the happy absorption of someone doing exactly what they were made to do. She was planning a small structure for the northwest corner of the parcel near the spring source. Not a house yet, the house would come later with time and resource. A working shelter first, a beginning. "Here," she said, planting the first stake in the ground. "This is the corner." He held the measuring line while she walked the perimeter of the planned foundation. Her hat was pushed back on her head in the warm spring sun. She had stopped wearing the duster except on cold days, and in the light she wore a worn canvas jacket and work trousers and good boots. She was visible in a way she had never allowed herself to be before. Her own shape, her own face, her own. "It'll face east," she said, consulting the compass. "Morning light." "Good," he said. She looked up at him. "You've been quiet." "Just watching," he said. "Watching what?" "You," he said, simple, honest, in the way he'd learned to be. She looked at him for a moment in the spring light. Then she smiled fully, completely, the smile that he had first seen over a tin coffee cup on a cold November morning, and that had changed something in him irrevocably, and that he still, every single time, received like a gift. "Come help me with the east stake," she said. He walked across the new spring grass to where she was standing with the measuring line. And when he reached her, she was looking at the compass and her shoulder was warm against his arm in the morning sun. And the spring was running somewhere beneath them in the good, clean rock. And the sky above the Cimarron Basin was vast and entirely generous. He had never, in 42 years, felt more precisely where he was supposed to be. She told him, piece by piece over the spring months, the parts of her story she hadn't told him at the Dry Creek crossing. They were the harder pieces, the pieces she had been carrying longer and had held closer and needed more time with before she could set them down in front of another person and trust them to be held with care. He received each piece the way he had always received things from her, without flinching, without overreaction, without the particular invasive sympathy that feels like trespass. He just listened. He just held it. He was, in this as in everything, reliable. She told him about Beaumont, about the things that had happened there after her mother died, in the specific and unlovely ways that the frontier found to treat young women without protection. She told him without seeking pity and without dramatizing, in the plain, factual manner of someone reporting terrain. Here is what happened. Here is what the land looked like. Here is what I learned to navigate it. He was quiet when she finished. Then, I'm sorry that happened to you. It made me who I am, she said. It was something she had said before to herself, the way you say things to yourself to make them manageable. It made some of who you are, he said. It didn't make all of you, you made the rest. You did that yourself. She looked at him. I mean that, he said. She believed him. She had learned over the winter to believe him. It had been a practice, a deliberate daily choice, like learning a new language, deciding each day to trust the vocabulary of his consistency. She was still learning. She expected to be learning for a long time. That was all right. She was staying. She was also, slowly, and with the characteristic caution that she applied to all things, allowing herself to be known by the town. Not performing the past, not making declarations, simply being present as herself, the woman who lived in the house at the edge of town, who read geological maps and did odd work and had strong opinions about coffee, who sat at the library on Wednesdays and at the general store porch at noon, who was clearly and visibly, to anyone paying attention, in love with Elia's colt of the North Ridge Open Hand Ranch. Miss Finch had known almost from the beginning. She had added the second library chair without comment, and she had, one Wednesday in March, set a book on the table between them, a collection of natural philosophy essays without explanation, and on the dedication page there was a note in her own handwriting, in pencil. For the ones who find what they were looking for in unexpected places, the library congratulates you both. CF. Samara had read it and looked at Elias, and he had looked back at her with an expression that contained a great deal that he did not, for once, choose to understate. He took her hand under the table, where Miss Finch could not technically see it, though Miss Finch was quite certainly aware of it. On a warm evening in May, sitting on the step of the Cimarron parcel shelter, which was now framed and roofed and smelled of fresh timber, watching the sun go down over the basin, Samara asked him a question she had been holding for a long time. What do you want, she said, in 10 years, the actual thing you want, not the practical version. He looked at the sunset. He thought about it genuinely, because she deserved genuine answers and he had been practicing giving them. This, he said, essentially this, you and the land and the work and he stopped, started again. I want to wake up knowing where you are. I want Wednesday mornings at the library. I want to watch you figure out a problem on a map. I want to bring you coffee that you drink too hot. He paused. I want to keep coming back to where you are 3 times a day. That's what I want. She looked at him for a long time. That's what I have for you, she said. I know, he said. And in return? Nothing's in return, he said. I've told you, it doesn't work that way with me. She almost argued with that. He could see her almost arguing, Old habit, old economy. Then she let it go. Let the argument pass. Chose instead to lean slowly, deliberately, the way she made all deliberate choices against his side, shoulder to arm, the warmth of her against the warmth of him in the early summer evening. "I'm going to plant something here," she said, looking out at the parcel. "Next spring, something that comes back every year." "What?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "Something that takes root." He looked at the basin and the sky and the woman beside him and thought about things that take root, about springs that feed underground for miles, about hands laid flat on stone offering something without condition. "Yeah," he said, "that sounds right." She reached down and found his hand. He held it. The evening came in soft and warm over the Cimarron Basin, and the first stars appeared in the east, and the shelter stood on its new timber framing on Samara's land, and the world was large and quiet and entirely possible. He had told himself, for most of his adult life, that he was not a man who needed much. He'd believed it. It had seemed true or true enough. He needed the land. He needed the work. He needed the long, clean days on the North Ridge and the cattle and the fence lines and the geological sense of stability that comes from knowing a particular piece of earth well enough to read its moods. He had not known until Samara what he was missing. Not the absence of it, he'd known the absence, in the thin, formless way you know about the absence of something you've never fully had, but the thing itself, the specific warm weight of it. Connection, real connection, the kind that doesn't ask you to edit yourself into something smaller. He had spent 42 years building an interior that was large and honest and self-sufficient, and it had served him well, and it had also been, in the most fundamental way, alone. He was not alone now. He thought about this on the mornings when he rode into Dustfall and found her at the well. She still went to the well, out of habit, out of affection for the routine that had been theirs from the beginning, and saw her face in the early light, her hat pushed back, her own voice audible in the quiet morning street. He thought about it on Wednesdays at the library, across the small table, watching her read 2 books simultaneously with the focused diagonal intelligence that was entirely, specifically, incomparably hers. He thought about it in the evenings at the ranch house, going over survey maps, making plans, talking about the land and the work and the ideas that she never stopped generating. He thought about it on the nights, rarer than he'd have wished but precious in exact proportion to their rarity, when she stayed at the ranch and the house was warm with 2 people in it instead of 1, and the world outside was dark and cold and entirely manageable, and the open hand formation on the western ridge held its shape in the dark, patient and offered, the way it had always been. He thought, "I have been given something extraordinary." He thought, "I will not waste it." He thought, "I will keep coming back, every day, 3 times a day without fail, for as long as she'll have me." And this thought, which was both a declaration and a promise and the most private and most important thing he had ever held, he kept in the same place he kept all the things that mattered most to him, close to his chest, near his heartbeat, where it was warm. There was a morning, late in May, when the town was beginning to wake and the air smelled of spring water and warming earth, and Samara was already at the well when he arrived, earlier than usual, standing in the morning light with her coffee already in hand, her hat pushed back, her face turned up to the sky. She heard him coming. She always heard him coming. She turned before he could say anything and looked at him with an expression so unguarded, so simply glad, that it stopped him 6 feet away. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. She held out his coffee, which she had already gotten, because she had learned his schedule as well as he had learned hers. He took it. Their fingers overlapped on the cup for a moment, her slim ones, his rough ones, before she let go. He stood beside her and looked at the street. Dustfall was waking up around them, shutters opening, smoke from chimneys, the distant lowing of cattle in someone's pasture, me starting her breakfast fire at the hotel, Miss Finch's window showing a light that meant she was already reading. Samara drank her coffee. He drank his. "I was thinking," she said, after a comfortable silence, "about the east fencing on the Cimarron parcel. The terrain map suggests there's a—" "I know," he said. "I was thinking about it too." She looked at him. "You were thinking about my fencing." "I was thinking about your land," he said. "I think about it most mornings." A pause, the almost smile that had become, over the months, a full and unhidden smile. "That's," she started. "I know," he said. "It's a lot." "No," she said, and the smile was warm and real and entirely hers. "It's not a lot, it's—" She stopped. "It's everything. You're—" Another stop. She shook her head slightly, which was what she did when words weren't cooperating with what she meant. "You just are for me, everything. You just are." He looked at her, at the morning light on her face and the enormous sky behind her, and the wild, simple fact of her presence in his world. "I know," he said for the last time. Because he did know. He had always known. He'd known it since the first cold morning at the well, when the day was the color of dying embers, and a figure in an oversized duster was drawing water in the quiet, and something in his chest had caught like a splinter in weathered skin. Not painful, not dramatic. Just present, just real, just impossibly permanently there. He brought coffee 3 times a day. He came to the library on Wednesdays. He helped file the claim on the Cimarron land, and he mended the fence on the east parcel, and he rode to Trinidad and back and sat across from her in the corner table at Me's dining room and walked beside her in the early mornings when dustfall was still and the world was new. He never missed it. 3 times a day. Without fail. And everything, slowly, gently, completely, was exactly where it was supposed to be. Finn. Sparkle's epilogue 1 year later. The house on the Cimarron parcel went up in October. It wasn't large. It didn't need to be. It had 2 rooms and a good roof and a window facing east for the morning light, and a step that Samara fixed herself before anyone else noticed it was crooked. Elias helped with the framing. Old Pete helped with the roof. Miss Finch came out for the raising day with a cold pie and a copy of a surveying manual she'd been saving, which she presented to Samara with the composed satisfaction of a woman distributing treasure. In the spring, Samara planted something in the plot south of the house. It came back every year after that. Wild sage, it turned out. The kind that takes root in rocky soil and spreads slowly and smells like rain on high ground and is, once established, nearly impossible to remove. She had chosen well. The road runs both ways between the Open Hand Ranch and the Cimarron land. 11 miles of good trail. Elias knows every turn. He rides it 3 times a day. He has never missed it. Bell closing call to action. If this story reached something in you, something you don't quite have words for, then you already know what it means. That's what a good story does. It finds the feeling before the name. Drop a comment below. What moment hit you the hardest? Was it the note on the road, the lamplight in the small room, the hand at the well trough, the word yes said 3 times with nothing asked in return? Tell me, I want to know. If you're new here, hit subscribe and ring that bell, because Wild West Chronicles goes deep. Every story in this series is built the same way. Slow, honest, real. The kind of love that builds like a spring that feeds underground, invisible until suddenly it isn't, and then it's everywhere. Thumbs up like this video if you stayed until the end. If you stayed, you know why. You don't need me to explain it. And finally, should I tell you what happened the winter after? Because there is a winter after, and there is a story in it. And Samara's land has a visitor from Beaumont who doesn't know what she's found here. And Elias colt. Quiet and stubborn and absolutely certain about what he loves. He is going to have to say some things out loud that he has never said out loud before. Part 2 is waiting. Should I tell you?